Hi friends and Climate Core team. In this video, I'll be walking you through some uncommon but field-tested strategies to address climate change on the national scale. So stay tuned if you're interested in what it might look like if the United States responded to this predicament with the seriousness that it demands. My message is also specifically catered to the new American Climate Core team. For anyone who's unfamiliar, the American Climate Corps is a new U.S. government initiative to train young people in jobs to help address climate change. Things like clean energy, home retrofitting, conservation work, and more. They are currently holding listening sessions to take input from the public. You can share your own ideas with the Climate Corps team by following the link below. Who am I? I'm Levi, a small-scale permaculture homesteader in northern Michigan. I've been obsessed with experimenting and studying climate change solutions for years at my farm, Realize Homestead. In this video, I'll highlight many successful real-world examples related to water, cities, forests, farms, community resilience, the economy, and more, as well as guiding principles that connect all these different topics together. But first, a story. Have you ever heard of the Loess Plateau? If not, let me tell you about it. It's a large mountainous region in China, and for thousands of years, it functioned as China's breadbasket. That is, until overuse and unsustainable management practices led to a downward spiral of drought and erosion, which ultimately sent many local residents into poverty. Don't worry though, this story has a happy ending. In 1994, China and the World Bank got together to restore the ecological health of the Loess Plateau with huge success. Local residents were involved in the planning process and restoration work. This included very simple techniques to restore the land. For example, by planting native trees on steep slopes. The tree roots hold the soil in place when it rained, preventing it from eroding down into the valleys. Other methods they used were building flat terraces into the hillsides for crops and installing check dams in the river valleys. What are check dams? Check dams are basically leaky dams. By slowing down the water, any suspended particles of soil that eroded off the hillsides would settle out and become a sponge of water and nutrients that could grow more vegetation. In a related case study, over 2,000 check dams were installed by ranchers in part of the Chiricahua Mountains of southeast Arizona. When the USGS studied this watershed, they found that the landscape held 28% more water than surrounding areas, and the check dams sequestered or absorbed 200 metric tons of CO2 per hectare out of the atmosphere and into the soil and vegetation. That's comparable to the sequestration rate of native wetlands, some of the most biologically productive places on Earth. Imagine treating all the parts of the US facing water shortages with check dams and similar techniques to rehydrate the landscape, helping fuel more vegetation growth and hence carbon sequestration. Back in China, the Loess Plateau Restoration Project not only restored soils, wildlife habitat, and sequestered tons of carbon out of the atmosphere, but it also lifted 2.5 million people out of poverty in less than 10 years. Farmers' incomes doubled and even tripled in some places. The project completely transformed an area the size of Maryland, 8.6 million acres, from wasteland into hyper-productive land, with a total investment of about $500 million. In today's dollars, that means you could restore the land area of the entire United States for about $250 billion, which sounds like a lot, but it's just a third of the annual US defense budget. One large selling point for an approach like this is that ecosystem restoration is a one-time investment that reaps rewards for generations to come. And imagine how many Americans could be lifted out of poverty with meaningful work. Of course, not all the land needs to be restored, but I just like to get a sense of how realistic something at that scale might be. A lot of the ideas I'm sharing wouldn't be considered realistic or politically feasible, but at this brainstorming phase, I think it's best not to put those limits on our ideas. Ideas are cheap and plentiful. We can always prune and filter them down later, but a bold vision can help open up our collective imaginations and inspire us in important ways, even if, in the end, we fall far short of the ideal. Now, continuing with our water theme, here's another success story. Brad Lancaster, an expert in the field of rainwater management, lives in Tucson, Arizona, one of the hottest and most arid regions of North America, with an annual rainfall of only about 12 inches. He observed how much precious rainwater was being wasted as it ran down the street near his house into storm sewers. Lancaster then set out to transform his small urban lot to collect and absorb as much of this rainwater as possible. He installed rainwater catchment along his roof eaves, which flowed into cisterns or tanks that could be used during the dry season to water his gardens and fruit trees. He diverted the water from his home sinks and washing machine into living plant beds that clean the water biologically. He even cut the curb alongside his property and diverted the street water into large retention basins to clean and absorb that water into the soil instead of letting it flow away. Lancaster's 1/8 acre property catches and absorbs about 100,000 gallons of rainwater a year. This turns his parched land into a sponge that nourishes food-bearing shade trees, abundant gardens, and a thriving landscape. Not only does all this additional plant growth sequester tons of CO2, but by diverting the water away from the municipal treatment systems, it also reduces the energy needed to pump and treat all that water. Many US cities today struggle with an issue called combined sewer overflow, or CSO. Essentially, when a large rain event overwhelms the normal city stormwater system, all this water then flows into the city's sewer system, flushing untreated wastewater into any nearby waterways like rivers and lakes. We've literally made the world our toilet. Conventional thinking might try to address this problem with larger and larger overflow areas. In Chicago, they converted an old quarry, the Thornton Quarry, into a 3 billion gallon overflow storage for the city's stormwater, with a project costing $4 billion and spanning 50 years. Imagine, instead, transforming thousands of homes into rainwater harvesting oases like Lancaster's that also provide food and wildlife habitat. Based on some rough back-of-napkin calculations, it would take about 60,000 average-size home lots to absorb the equivalent 3 billion gallons as the quarry. That's about 1 in every 20 house lots in Chicago. With that same $4 billion budget, that would be $66,000 per house. You could do a lot with that. Scaled up to the entire nation, that would add up to about half the annual defense budget. Now let's give these hypothetical homes a special name, like the urban Oasis Homesteads. I'll revisit this idea later on. Another benefit of an approach like this is that it's fairly accessible to the average individual, because all this water catchment and storage infrastructure is on the surface. There's no need for giant excavators and teams of engineers to maintain and fix it. It's human scale. Besides, most major US cities don't conveniently have an enormous old quarry nearby. With 40 out of 50 US states expecting water shortages over the next decade, these are the types of distributed, human-scale, nature-based solutions I believe the Climate Corps should be mobilizing armies of people to get behind. Speaking of armies, we need to acknowledge the hypocrisy of this administration funding the Climate Corps while also readily funding wars and genocides overseas. The planet-warming emissions generated during the first 2 months of the war in Gaza were greater than the annual carbon footprint of more than 20 of the world's most climate-vulnerable countries. Not to mention the profound toll of human suffering that will reverberate for decades to come. To address this climate crisis, it's not enough to just ask ourselves, what should we do? It's just as important, if not more important, to ask ourselves, what should we not do? In addition to the massive ecological impacts of war and military action around the world, another major source of greenhouse gas emissions is transportation. You know, cars. This shouldn't be news by now, but it's a tricky problem because US cities have invested so much into car-centered infrastructure and city planning. In Los Angeles, only 5% of the population rides the bus each day. By comparison, in Curitiba, Brazil, 75% of the 3.8 million people living there ride the bus daily, leading to a 30% reduction in gasoline use compared to similar cities. How did they achieve this? With good design. First, they ensured the buses would be a fast and efficient way to travel by creating dedicated bus lanes. You buy your ticket at the bus station instead of on the bus, speeding up boarding time. And one ticket can last for multiple journeys. The bus fare is the same everywhere you go, and no one lives more than a quarter mile from a bus stop. They also came up with a cool idea where people could collect trash and exchange it for bus tokens, helping to keep the city clean. In Curitiba, growth, like taller buildings, is restricted to special transportation corridors that are served by high-speed bus lines stretching out away from the city. This creates a unique star-shaped development pattern, in contrast to radially symmetric cities, where traffic and wealth is highly concentrated in one congested downtown. This also creates more edge space between the dense urban and sparse rural regions, like interlacing fingers. This reduces the distance needed to truck resources and waste back and forth between urban and rural areas. Normally, I'm very skeptical of government intervention and imposing some master plan on people in a top-down hierarchical way. All too often, these tend to benefit the planners and exclude the undesirables. But, as the case of Curitiba clearly shows, our cities can be much more efficient and egalitarian if we can agree on some basic broad patterns to coordinate and organize our actions and infrastructure. So, it seems there's a careful balance to find between top-down planning and bottom-up grassroots organization. On that note, next, let me tell you about a great example of that bottom-up grassroots organization. Kensington Market in Toronto is a 4-block by 4-block neighborhood that boasts hundreds of diverse shops, restaurants, music, and cultural events. It all started when immigrants moved in and ignored the zoning bylaws that attempted to restrict the neighborhood to purely residential use. They began opening shops out of the fronts of old Victorian houses, selling everything from produce, deli meats, and even live chickens. Today, this neighborhood has become a tourist destination for its cultural richness and vibrancy. Instead of one central downtown, imagine 1,000 little downtowns like Kensington Market, spread all over our cities. Simple changes to city planning and zoning can dramatically reduce traffic and emissions while fostering the freedom and flexibility for our communities to grow naturally. Speaking of growing naturally, let's talk about one of my favorite subjects next, trees. Did you know that intentionally planted trees can reduce air conditioning needs by 30% and save 20 to 50% in heating costs? Plus, tree cover can lower air temperatures by around 10 degrees in urban areas. So, in addition to retrofitting and better insulating our buildings, the Climate Corps should invest heavily in regreening our cities and suburbs with trees. Trees are important living infrastructure. They're not just optional decorations added as an afterthought. Trees also have a significant impact on the mental health of residents. One study found that people living in neighborhoods with 30% or more tree canopy were almost 1/3 less likely to experience psychological distress than those living in areas with less canopy cover. And why not combine Brad Lancaster's curb cutting idea here? Plant urban trees in recessed basins that can collect and use the rainwater from streets and parking lots, instead of elevated beds requiring additional irrigation. Plus, these city trees can provide valuable resources like fruit, nuts, lumber, and firewood in dense population areas that have traditionally needed most of their resources imported. On that note, let's talk about food. A whopping 44% of the land area of the US is dedicated to agriculture, and around 1/3 of global emissions are caused by our food and agricultural systems. The good news is that there's huge potential for agriculture to have positive effects on ecological health and atmospheric CO2 concentrations when done right. Proper soil management practices alone can offset 20 to 35% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Plus, there's even more potential by incorporating trees and forests intelligently into our agricultural systems through a practice known as agroforestry. No, that doesn't mean aggressive forestry, although that sounds kind of cool. It's a combination of agriculture and forestry. One agroforestry practice is called silvopasture, which incorporates trees into animal pastures. This helps reduce stress on the animals, stabilize and shade the soil, and provide an additional crop on the same land, such as timber or chestnuts. This is something I'm experimenting with here at Realize Homestead. For cropland, trees can be incorporated through a practice known as alley cropping, planting rows of productive trees into croplands and cultivating the crops between the tree rows. The book Restoration Agriculture demonstrates how this transition can take place while increasing total yield of the land. Another opportunity for reforestation is the steep slopes over 20% to prevent erosion and soil loss, just like we saw at the Loess Plateau in China. And finally, it's important that trees be established along all waterways in our agricultural lands. There is a 7,000 square mile dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico where there is so little oxygen that almost no life exists beneath the surface waters. This is caused by the massive amounts of chemical fertilizers being dumped on fields in the Midwest, then running off into streams and rivers, and eventually down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico. A 30 to 100 foot wide strip of vegetation along a waterway, also known as a riparian buffer strip, can remove up to 80% of excess nutrients from entering waterways. So we need riparian plantings along our entire watershed in these agricultural zones. Trees are the backbone of ecosystems, so they're fundamental to any sustainable form of agriculture. Plus, these agroforestry strategies are some of the most powerful tools we have to sequester and store excess CO2 out of the atmosphere, according to Project Drawdown. It's important to recognize, though, that a single farmer can't manage thousands of acres of these diverse agro-ecosystems using GPS-guided tractors and combines like they do with corn and soybeans. Since the dawn of industrial agriculture in the 20th century, the average farm size in the US has doubled, and the number of farms has dropped by 60%. We went from 33% of the population working in agriculture to less than 2% today. In order to grow our food in a truly sustainable way, we need to reverse these trends. We need many more hands in the soil and many more and smaller farms. This suggests a new rural revitalization program is needed. This could include providing anyone who wants to farm with the training, land, tools, and startup capital needed. There are many examples of such programs we can learn from, like South Korea's New Village movement and the Scottish crofting system. By providing housing along with the farmland, such a program could help alleviate the nationwide shortage of affordable housing, while also getting people back on the degraded and abused farmland, where their hands and hearts are needed for important restoration work. There could even be fun competitions between these new farmer villages to see who can build the most topsoil or plant the most trees or collect the most rainwater. In India, the Paani Foundation hosts an annual Farmers' Cup, where farmer collectives compete to lower costs, implement low-carbon best practices, improve productivity, and improve the sustainability of their farming. In 2002, the top farmer groups saw a 50% increase in crop yields and a 108% increase in per-acre profits by implementing scientifically sustainable farming practices. Not only has it brought long-lasting prosperity to these villages, but it's also encouraged greater cooperation among growers. Now, you've probably noticed how organic and sustainably grown food is a lot more expensive than conventional food. So if we transition the entire agricultural sector, including training up millions of new farmers, won't that make all our food more expensive? This gets into complex economic issues that I don't have time for in this video. But our entire economic system based on growth and debt needs to be completely reimagined. I will mention that currently, conventional agriculture is subsidized by the federal government. Plus, the true cost of these cheap foods includes degraded soil, polluted waterways, and a public health crisis caused by cheap, unhealthy food. These costs aren't included in the price we see at the supermarket, and instead become the burden of the whole society. Likewise, farmers whose practices sequester CO2 and create wildlife habitat, purify water, and create healthier people don't get paid for these additional public services they provide. If we design our economic system to truly account for all these costs and benefits, then I think it would be a very different story. If we want true transformative change, then the most economic choice at the grocery store also needs to be the most healthy and ecologically beneficial one. Of course, these types of economic changes will never be possible as long as big corporations continue to undermine our democracy through self-serving political influence. Political corruption and environmental protection are connected. We need campaign finance reforms, real anti-corruption legislation, closing tax loopholes, and more to correct this imbalance and rein in the influence of money on politics. The movement Represent Us is doing great work in this area. Going further, the government needs to be more honest with the American people about the seriousness of our situation. It's thought that it takes 10 to 20 years for emissions to have their full impact, and more than a third of all excess greenhouse gases were emitted in the last 20 years. That means even if we completely stop burning all fossil fuels today, it's going to get worse before it gets better. We really should have been doing this work 30 to 50 years ago, but here we are. That means, in addition to climate change mitigation strategies like I've been discussing, we also need to consider adaptation strategies to prepare for the disruptions we're likely to face in coming decades. So, how can we cultivate more resilient communities? When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, 80% of the city was flooded for weeks, causing over 1,300 deaths and destroying over 800,000 homes. The federal response to the emergency was abysmal, particularly in poor, predominantly African American neighborhoods. Many residents remained stranded without water, food, or shelter for many days after the storm had passed. This brings me back to the concept of distributed solutions. If more communities had the support, skills, and tools to provide for some of their own needs, they would be much better positioned for unexpected emergencies, whether it's hurricanes, wildfires, floods, or supply chain disruptions. And there's a precedent for it. During World War II, governments encouraged people to plant victory gardens, basically home gardens, to help reduce the pressure on the food supply during wartime. At one point, victory gardens provided roughly 40% of all the produce consumed in the United States. Remember that idea of the urban oasis homesteads, where 1 in 20 households is transformed into a water harvesting sponge and plant growing sanctuary like Brad Lancaster's place in Arizona? Building on this idea, these special homes could also act as community centers during times of emergency. They could be equipped with backup power generators, emergency food supplies, communication systems, tool and seed libraries, and more, while being mindful of demographic patterns that have made certain communities more vulnerable. Backups and redundancies are fundamental to building resilience. The original internet was designed as a highly stable and resilient communications network by the US Defense Department during the Cold War era. This led to the development of a decentralized network architecture, where data is broken into small packets and routed through multiple paths. If one or several nodes is taken offline unexpectedly, the data is instantly rerouted through other nodes, keeping the communication channels open. These community-centered homes can help act like these nodes of a decentralized network, ensuring basic services are maintained. Another essential component of community resilience is social cohesion and trust. So these community centers could provide a gathering place for the community during normal times as well. Perhaps they could host educational hands-on workshops on everything from tool use and repair to gardening, foraging, food preservation, and more. Not everyone would want to live in such a house, even if they were paid. But I could imagine some old retiree would jump at the chance to play den mother to her neighborhood. Maybe there could be an open door policy and free coffee 24/7 and a community potluck and swap meet once a week. It's like the idea of the third spaces, if you've heard about those. As people see the productivity and beauty of these ecological community centers, they can also act as seed sites, helping to replicate and spread these ideas and practices, as well as spreading the literal seeds of locally adapted plant varieties. Maybe this sounds a bit far-fetched, but there is already a precedent for something not too different. Public libraries. A neutral gathering space where everyone is welcome. Resources are shared freely, and participation isn't predicated on consuming or purchasing anything. Maybe public libraries can act as more of a regional hub, to provide a connecting point for all these smaller community center households, like a meeting of the den mothers and fathers. Okay, now I'll admit I'm getting into the clouds a bit. Let me bring us back down to earth by wrapping up with some of the harsh realities we're facing. It's important to acknowledge the United States' unique role as the primary benefactor of the past century of globalization. The US accounts for only 5% of the world population, but consumes up to 20% of its resources. And no, it's not because we're just that much smarter and harder working. Perhaps you've heard the little tidbit that if everyone in the world lived like a North American, we would need 5 Earths to sustain them. The implication of these truths is that we Americans need to learn to live with dramatically less than we're used to. That's a hard pill to swallow when about 63% of Americans are already living paycheck to paycheck. So where's the slack that can be trimmed without causing more hardship? Billionaires! One of the biggest consumers of energy and resources is the US military-industrial complex, as I mentioned before, which needs a serious budget cut. Another potential waste that can be trimmed is the health insurance industry, by replacing it with a national healthcare system like basically all the other developed nations. Plus, there's the fossil fuel industry, the prison industrial complex, banking, finance. You know what? I think we will be able to trim the fat after all. And all those excess people working in those sectors will need to be retrained and reskilled as well, not just the youth. Still, these realities mean a significant change in our future expectations and the American way of life for pretty much everyone on some level. The good news is that consuming less doesn't mean our lives would be any less enjoyable. The average Costa Rican uses 1/6 the energy of the average North American, and yet they report similar levels of happiness and life satisfaction. Costa Rica actually abolished its military in 1948 and focused its national budget instead on social programs and strengthening democratic institutions. It's considered an oasis of political stability and development in Central America. A serious discussion is also needed around reparations for the fact that the impacts of climate change often affect those in the global south who are least responsible for the emissions that cause it. Speaking of reparations, it's vital that the voices of Native Americans and other historically marginalized communities are heard and heeded for any climate core plans. In the coming years, hundreds of millions of people are likely to be uprooted by rising seas, drought, searing temperatures, and other climate catastrophes. If you think immigration is an issue now, just wait till the mass migrations really get underway. There is important work being done to re-envision refugee camps from places of dependency and desperation to places of regeneration and creation. There are now dozens of ecosystem restoration camps around the world, combining camping with ecosystem restoration work. And Permaculture for Refugees is an organization that empowers displaced peoples with the knowledge and resources to implement immediate solutions for short-term survival, while also supporting ongoing land rehabilitation and social cooperation. Whew. Okay, let's finally wrap all this up. Here's a list of all the ideas and guiding principles I've outlined in this video so far. Clearly, all of this together represents a radical transformation of our current institutions and way of life. But in the words of the climate scientist Kevin Anderson, there are no non-radical pathways left for us to address climate change. Yet, trying to implement changes too quickly can be destabilizing in and of itself and create public backlash. So it seems sensible to create a 5-year transition plan to implement major changes and allow people and businesses time to adapt. 5 years might not sound like a lot of time, but honestly, we don't have a lot of time. Zooming out now, I hope it's becoming clear that the root cause of climate change and the environmental crisis isn't just the use of fossil fuels for energy. It's the separation and fragmentation of our society that cheap energy has enabled. Families have spread out across the country. Community just sounds like an empty buzzword because we're so far removed from one. We have separated ecology from agriculture, nature preserves, and strip mine farms. And we've separated the production of basic human needs food, water, basic materials, into factories far from our human settlements where we live and spend our time, out of sight, out of mind. This has created a culture with no deep connection with the source of its own sustenance, nature. So our innate relationship and caring and daily engagement with the sources of life has been replaced by a layer of abstraction, the monetary system. Money has become the surrogate for all other needs. So the pursuit of money supersedes all else. We need to bend and contort ourselves in very unnatural ways to appease this often fickle and insatiable abstraction of life. It's no wonder why mental health issues are rampant. And it's no wonder why anytime a decision is made, the economic concerns always seem to trump the ecological concerns. We need to reintegrate these back together again. We need a new declaration of interdependence, uniting ecology, agriculture, human settlements, families, and communities. And while an official climate corps could help a lot, we can't wait around for top-down solutions, whether institutional or metaphysical. You can begin this healing work today with bottom-up grassroots solutions at your own back doorstep. The Climate Corps can play a constructive role in helping realize this dream if executed wisely. So thank you for taking the time to listen today. Goodbye for now.